Thank you for inviting me. It's very nice seeing some old faces and old friends that I haven't seen in a while, although it's only virtually, but it's still nice seeing you. Hopefully during the Q&A, we can get some to interact. So today's topic, it's a new direction that I'm heading. It's different than my previous work, so I'm actually quite excited. It's the first time I'm sharing it. I'm going to share parts of two papers that hopefully soon will be out, at least in bioRxiv, but it's a whole new direction for the lab, so I'm happy to share it and looking forward to hear comments and whatever you have to say. So, neural mechanism of adaptive behavior. So, animals and humans, we live in very dynamic and very complex environment. And one thing that is important for our survival is the ability to adapt quickly to this changing environment. Sometimes it could be even small changes, implicit changes in the environment that we need, like a change in the supply of food or a nearby predator, the existence of a nearby predator. And we need to change our policy, our behavior policy rather fast doing that. By the way, this image I just created using ChatGPT. There'll be a few more of those ChatGPT created images in the talk. So what I'm going to share is actually two studies that are somehow related. The first one is the one that actually written on the abstract, which is neural mechanism of adaptive cognition, which is more to the theoretical side. But then I realized that this is a 45-50 minute talk without questions, and I figured that I might actually run faster than I expect. So there's another section about corticocerebellar mechanism for motor adaptation. And if we'll have time at the end, I'll also share about 10 minutes about interesting results that we have in this project. So let's start first with the more cognitive side, more theoretical side. So when agent animals or humans interact with the world, basically they want to adapt their activity to the world around them. And this is usually being studied or prepared using reinforcement learning. And we see here the general framework. Do you see my pointer, by the way? Oh, perfect. So if an agent could be a human animal neural network that is acting with the environment. The environment may change, the state will change, it gives reward back to the agent then decides, given the state of the environment, what action should it choose next. But what happens when the environment is not very clear? It's not clear, the environment is changing and it's not sending clear signals or complete signals about this current state. So this general idea is being addressed using partially observed Markov decision process. You can imagine a Markov model, and you can look at it as it's a combination of a hidden Markov chain and a Markov decision process that gives us a partially observable Markov decision process in which we have to make decision given only partial information about the environment. And basically, it seems like it's like putting on this murky glasses over the world, and we're not getting the entire information that you would like. So in order to address and to solve this problem, this is not a new problem. How do agents decide or which policy or what action to take? How does the basic policy? And the grounding idea is to use belief states or internal belief states, which are internal representations of the agent about the external world. And the most straightforward way to define it is using a distribution function of a possible state of the parameter. So there's a belief state. Here we see it's a joint. Usually it would be some kind of a Gaussian of all the parameters of the environment. And the idea is that if we existed somewhere in the parameter space or the variable space of the environment, the internal representation will be some Gaussian of it. And from this Gaussian, we can make inference and find out where are we actually, what are the latent states of the environment, and base a decision upon that. Now, how do we update that as the environment changes? So the classical way is to look at Kadmon filters. I won't go into Kadmon filter theory here, but the idea is, they give us a way to create prediction and compare it to the actual observation, so those beliefs can be updated slowly. But there are some issues with this Kadmon filters, especially when we're looking at biology. First, Kadmon filters are optimized for linear dynamics. And the question is, what happens when the underlying dynamics of the world is not linear? Then the question is, a real neural implementation of belief updates? We're looking at agent and animal, we're thinking about neuroscience, so we should look at everything through the lens of neural network. In neural network, learn this type of update. And the third one, what happens when the reward is sparse? We see that this is an issue that's not very frequently addressed. And how can we learn those representations? What you can do when there's not a reward signal from the environment. So this work is a joint effort. So there are two students in my lab that are spearheading this project, John Schwartz and Jan Bauer. And it's been collaborative work with the Eran Lotem's lab here at ELSEC, where Gabi and Hanin did the experiments with the mice, which we're going to see some of the results here today. So what are we trying to study in this? Basically, we're trying to create a model that does not overlook some of the difficulties that people sometimes overlook in previous models. One of them is we want to look at adapting changes in complex environments. So usually when you think about this type of experiment, people are looking at a mice or agent working in a two-armed bandit, where he has to make a choice or fourth choice between several options and then get immediate rewards. And so forth, while the mouse adapts to changes, for example, in this environment. Obviously, this is not a good representation for a real environment for animals. If I would have to depict it, it would be more like a mouse playing pinball while standing on a ball. So the dynamic is much more environment, requires much more fast inference of what's going on and control. The second thing is we need to look for solutions that have neural implementations. So there are a lot of theoretical, especially in the realm of robotics, of how to guide robots, but we need to look at neural implementation not only that are implemented by neural network, but can be learned by a neural network under the framework of reinforcement learning. And the third one, we will sometimes want to do it without trial and error. And why is that? Because there are situations where you cannot just afford yourself to do trial and error. So how do you adapt or change your perspective over the current environment, or change your current beliefs when you don't want to act and put yourself in danger? It could be because it might be dangerous to act or ineffective. Now, many studies dealt with those, but the idea is to combine all of those problems together and get some simple task that kind of represent all of that and study it. So this is what we did, and now I'm going to start presenting the simple world or toy problem that we've created in order to deal with the problem. We have a simple world that has two latent variables. We have a state variable that can be either 0 or 1. We'll call it unsafe and safe state. Second. And we have a context variable, and in a few slides you see why it's called context, but it can take any value between 0 and 1. Now these are the latent variables of the environment, and the observation are just what the agent observes is just a single variable xt, which is at each time point either 0 or 1. And x1 basically is equal to 1 if the state is safe. So the agent knows that the environment is safe, but if it's unsafe, it might get the signal that the environment is unsafe with some probability 1 minus theta, or it gets some misleading safe cue if with probability theta. So this is misleading because it thinks that it's safe, but it's actually unsafe. We can write it down as a simple graphical model. So we have those two unrelated latent variables, but they interact together to create the observation, and there are some probability of them changing, which we will discuss in a second. But first, to understand what's going on in this task, so we can think about an episode where the safe variable, the latent variable, changes from unsafe to safe, while in the unsafe zone there is some kind of misleading goes that tells the mouse that or the agent, sorry, that it is safe, falsely signal a safe zone. And we can get there with with high reliability about the state or an unreliable reporting of state when highest data. So for example, let's try to see what happens. So I'm going to use some sound here. I hope you can hear it. And we're going to hear now beeps representing this input, and you need to signal. Usually I would ask you to clap, but we cannot do it here. But when you think that the environment is safe. So we'll start with the left one. Okay, I hope you noted yourself when you believe the environment is safe. And now in the other context. Now, I hope you were convinced by this simple experiment that the behavior pattern we're looking for is we should wait longer where theta is higher. We need to, when there's less certainty in the environment, it's more reliable, we need to accumulate more evidence before we decide if it's safe or not. So what is the task? The task is simple, is act when it's safe and don't act when it's not safe. So the agents get rewarded if they act during a safe state, and then after action, the state transforms back to the unsafe state. But if they act in an unsafe state, reward is withheld and the time is reset. So basically, they're suffering the cost of time negative rewards. We use that mainly because we wanted to use it with mice, and we don't want to use real negative rewards with mice. So the cost of time is a good enough incentive for them to learn the task. Okay, now how the task structure looks like and where we're going to start to see the challenges in this task. So we have two underlying variables here. We have the state that can switch with some probability lambda that defines us the rate which the state can switch, and we have the context that can switch. To make it easier, we just, instead of having theta as a continuous number, we can just choose any m number of possible theta it would take. Just easier for the notation, but it can be easily extended to a continuous one. The main point is that lambda is much larger than epsilon, so the state changes much more frequent than the theta variable. This is why I called it a context. So the longer time constant, we can take longer to infer. So we have those blocks of trials when during the trial, sometimes during the trial, the context could suddenly switch to a higher context, to a different level of noise, and the agent needs to infer it. So this is where the problem comes from. Because imagine the agent experiences this input, and then there is a large abnormal input of x equals 1 of safe state. Now the agent needs to decide, did the state change to be safe, or did the context change? And now I'm actually in a noisier environment. So there could be, it could update those two variables. You need to decide or to know which of the variables should be updated. If we want to put it more rigorously, what happens is that when conditions on the observations, those two latent variables are now dependent. Right? They were independent to begin with. We've seen the figure, the graphical model. But when we're conditioning on the observation, now they are dependent, and that makes inputs ambiguous. Okay, so you could do the test. You could give you some examples. You'll be able to do it, and more interestingly, mice can do it. And what do I mean by mice can perform the task? That they do not excel in the task, but we did two important measurements for the mice behavior to tell us that they understand the structure of the task. One is that the waiting time, as we said, higher theta requires longer waiting time, is modulated by the context. So they learn this kind of structure of the task. The second interesting thing is that there is a fast context switch. So here we see the correlation of the waiting time from the current block with the current block and with the previous block, average over different values of theta. And we see that very quickly they change the behavior, and most importantly, already in the first trial. So the mice did not need to make a mistake in order to change their model. they already start to adapt before the first try. And these are the two things that we would like to capture. So let's just do some calculation to see what we expect. So in general, it's not that animals maximize reward rate. It's not necessarily overall reward. It's true also in this process. If we give it a finite time horizon, the best thing to do is to maximize the reward rate. And in order to calculate, we defined a small graphical model that describes us what is the probability that we see consecutive safe evidence. So here on the numbers that you see, it's the number of consecutive safe evidence, meaning X equals 1. And they can be either signifying really safe zone, or they can signify a false safe. At each state, there's some probability of switching to the safe zone, or if you're in the unsafe, you can continue with there's some probability of getting a misleading safe zone. And at each point, there's some probability of actually getting a non-safe if you are truly in the unsafe zone, and then you're going to get started, but it's no longer consecutive evidences. And you start this over. So using this simple model, we can calculate what would be the maximum, what would be the reward rate, which is the average return divided by time, plus if we can add here some inter-trial interval. In this case, just the punishment that we have for the unsafe zone in the case of a no trial. So I won't go through the calculations, but just defining those B's and C, which B's just which are those using those variables, we can find the mean reward and the mean time, and just draw what would be the reward rate for a specific waiting time. This is a complete analytical solution, and we see that we can find there is an optimal solution here. Now, I won't compare this optimal solution to the mouse, and I'll tell you already, mice are not optimal. They're not doing the best way. They have a lot of impatience. These are some of the questions we're tackling. But instead, let's first see what happens when we're training a network on this task, and try to analyze how the network answers this task. Later on, we'll go back to it. So, training network. So we're training the network in a framework of reinforcement learning, and so we have a recurrent neural network. It can be one network or divided into actor and critic. It doesn't really matter. What it gets as input is the observation, the action at the previous time, the reward, and it spits out some action probability that goes to a softmax, which is a sort of a noise model of how we act, and then it decides on action. Now, for training, we used LSTM long short-term memory units, basically are gated units, so not the real vanilla network. What I'm going to show you actually work on vanilla network, and I will show you that at the end, but there are some issues with that, which I'll discuss at the end of this section. But for now, we're assuming using those LSTM networks because they can train and they solve the task without any problems. So we are training them on the task, many blocks like that, then the network need to respond at the correct time and get the reward. And we can see here, if we look at the epoch and here we can see that the waiting time on the y-axis, we see that over time this thing develops the correct separation between different wavelengths. So you see this gradient for different theta tells us that the network learned the different contexts. So let's look at the result, or the behavioral results. So again, as with the mice, we see that the networks are context-aware behaviors. There's some spread due to the noise, but they're context-aware, and that they're near optimal behavior. They're not really optimal behavior, and we'll see that we'll later discuss why. And they also show this fast switching that we've seen with the mice. So the qualitative of this behavior of the networks is similar to the animals. Now, in the animals, in the networks, we can look at what's going on to the network itself, to the dynamics. So it's not necessarily the best way to describe the activity of the network, but this is what we would usually do in neuroscience. So we look at the PCs of the activity. And if we look at the first principal component, we see that it pretty much tracks the number of consecutive goes, and we see that this kind of ramping activity that depends on the context. So the context already appears here in the PC1, And this is when we align the network upon action time. See that it starts. It's hard to see. It also starts from a little bit different baseline, but also they increase. It's increasing the ramp changes depending on the context. If we look at more of the PCs, we see more of the relevant dynamics. So we see again the first PC tracks the action probability. Here it's a line on action time, which is red, but then we can see the movement along here is when the context change. So we have the PC2 that tracks the actual context of the network. Okay, so this is enough, but this is nice, but we want to analyze it a little bit better and compare it to optimal performance and what the network is actually doing, how it's learning and how it's solving the task. And for that, we're going to turn into a Bayesian model of how it's best to solve this task. So going back to our belief states that we said at the beginning, so our belief state in this case would be a probability function of the current state and the current context, given all previous observations. And to get the estimators, we just need to take the average over those the margin over this average over these probabilities. From that, we can define an action. So our probability of acting is 1 if the state estimator is above some threshold and don't act otherwise. Well, this threshold, we can analytically define it because we already know what is the optimal time. So we can find the probability over this optimal time, this ideal optimal time, and define a threshold probability for the network to act. Okay, so this is nice. It gives us a frozen picture of the current activity and how one should react. But how do we update it? So for that, we're using the Chapman-Gove equation, which is basically just a way to develop, to evolve this equation in time. So here we're just doing some Bayesian activity. Here is the probability of being a state given the input, and sorry, the Z shouldn't have been here. But we explicitly put the current time here. And now we're breaking this probability. We're using Bayes' formula to look at the probability of finding X giving this data. And then what we're doing, and this is a part of the Chapman-Kolmogorov equation, we're doing time propagation of the joint probability function at the previous time. So T's are the transition matrices of going from the different states, and this is our belief at the previous state. You see the previous belief at times t, and here it's a belief at time t minus t, and you modulate it by your new observation that you get. Okay, so it's fairly simple, and we can analyze that. But what's important here that this belief update requires us to keep this joint probability of both S and theta. We can think of a naive Bayes update, which in this case the probability of S and T is wrong. Okay, this is just the Bayes, but in this case we assume that we can separate the S and theta, so the probability distribution is disjoint, or you can the uncorrelated, or the assumption of the model here that's uncorrelated, and you can propagate each one of them separately. So here you're not assuming a joint probability. So this is what we call a naive Bayesian update. And what happens here, the policies would be context agnostic, because we only operate given X, and we update, the S of update also does not depend on theta, then we expect some context agnostic. We'll just use it as reference. We know that this is not what's happening, but it will be a good reference to understand what the network is doing. So let's first look at the behavior. So the network behavior matches the Bayesian agents. First, we don't. Okay, so first we see the context. Here we saw that this is a network again. Here, and we can see the spread here. The stars are the probability distribution of the agent of the Bayesian agents that we use at Pascal. And we see that the suboptimal activity that we saw with the noise is also true in the optimal Bayesian agent. And again, the correlation of the fast context switching match very well between theta and the input. So it's very nice that their activity is, or that's the performance is the same, but in order to really understand the network, we need to look at the activity and what it's representing, and does it really represent somehow those Bayesian updates? That's what we're going to next. And to do that, we're actually going to look at the dynamics. And so we're going to use our graphical model to create a set of inputs. So here we have the set of input. And at first, we're going to feed this net to our network. And from the network, we're going to get estimates of our state and theta. And we're doing it, and this is important, that we're doing linear regression to the true values. Right? So we know the true values of theta and S, and we're doing linear regression, we get the estimate of S and theta. And we get the same input, and we can use the Bayesian update and get the estimator using Bayes, and then compare the two and see how the dynamics of these two and the dynamics of these two compare to each other. Okay, so first we look what happens to state inference. So here we see the state inference, both of the Bayesian and the network, giving some a set of input for a given context. And you can see here that the Bayesian agent and the network match pretty well, very different from this disjoint belief Bayesian, the more naive network. And again, I remind you that the regression is being made not to the Bayesian estimator, but the regression for the network is to the true underlying theta. So the fact that we see this dynamic here tells us more about the fact that what the network is really encoding. We can also look at the estimation of theta. So here we see on the background the blue, the Bayesian posterior marginalized over S. And we see the Bayesian agent readout, the neural network readout, and we see that they match pretty well. They're very close, and they're much worse than the disjoint belief. Again, telling us that the network is doing something more similar to the Bayes update. But let's dig a little bit deeper to see what's going on. So here we're looking at the state estimation for a given set of input. Again, we see that the network is following nice the Bayesian estimator, while the naive Bayes gives us is way off. But the more interesting thing is when we look at what happened, how does the what is the estimation, change in our estimation of the context? And here we see an interesting signature of this joint belief update. Because if our update is not joined, then every time the state did not change, and we have an on state, and then x equals 1, or safe evidence, and then unsafe evidence. So we know it's not safe here. So a naive update that is not aware of the context will keep going down, because now it gets a negative input. So just integrating over the input will give a negative change to the delta, to negative change to the estimator of the context, because the estimation of the context always follows the input. On the other hand, if you do have some structure of the problem learned, then what happens is this unsafe evidence tells you that you were actually unsafe the whole time. So you should increase your noise level and not decrease it. And as we see, both the Bayesian agent and the network increase their estimation of the theta. We can summarize it in a sort of a vector map of what's going on in the update. So we can do it for every point in the space, but I chose here 9 points that we can sample from, and what happens if you were getting a safe signal and an unsafe signal. So green would be a safe signal, red is an unsafe signal, and where the estimators should update for the full Bayesian. For comparison, the disjoint Bayesian gives us something completely different. And what we see that all over this space is the network reacts very, very closely to the or the activity of the network, the change in the network is very similar to the Bayesian update. Again, telling us that the network actually learned the dynamics of the joint Bayesian activity. Now, I would like to give you some neural data for the mice. Unfortunately, we don't have it yet. We're still waiting for the data, but this gives us a basis to look at once we get the data, this theoretical framework. I promised you that I'm going to talk about vanilla RNNs, which are more biological in some sense, or less not biological, like the LSTM. So as I said, they also solve the task. They don't do it as well. Interestingly, they're more similar to the mice, but I would address, I would just say because they're both are not doing it optimally. But still, you can see that just simple RNNs can still solve the task relatively well. The main problem is with it is a training. So it's hard to do training of the network. The training itself is unstable. If you overtrain them, you completely lost it, and you're unable to solve the task. If you know when to stop the training in the exact moment, you can get a point when the network acts very well. But the training is not yet solved, and that's a discussion for future work. Is why, how can we use training or more vanilla networks to train? Before ending this part of the talk, I would like to say some interesting things that can come out of it. So there's a work a couple of years ago, Vishnu, that they studied change of activity in humans in dyslexic and autistic syndrome humans, and the task here is a bit different. They have a rhythm presented to them, and at some point the rhythm change. There is some change in the spacing between consecutive goals when they have to clap, for example, and the human tends to change or to update their belief. And what they see in general, that autistic syndrome disabled people, they are slower to update their effective output. Our theory has a potential way to explain this slowness of updating over the environment. Few more things about some related work that some of it came up recently, but I think it points out the difference in this work. This is a very recent work. I think it was published a few months ago. Imagine a belief-like representation in neural network, very similar to what we're doing, but there are some critical difference between. So this is I think this is a work from Sam Gershman and Cheetah's lab at Harvard. So their network activity implements belief update just as we see it, but there are crucial difference between there are no behaviors, they only use value prediction. I'm not saying it is a downside, but they focused on the error prediction in the dopamine neuron. So they had a different question in mind. They have only a single dynamical variable, and because they're looking at the reward, this network basically just follows the reward all the time. What we see in our network is we don't have to follow the reward. We can make our networks does inference of the input without necessarily getting the reward. It's also related to the meta-learning of parameters. This is work out of DeepMind, where they show that the learning meta parameters, or in their case, the learning rate after training. So again, the network stop training, and then it operates in case in our, as well the network activity tracks the latent state as in our case. But again, the network follows the rewards, and there's no Bayesian theory. You saw it. So that just put in the spotlight our work, where what we've done is we had a partially observed Markov decision process with multiple dynamical state, and neural networks are able to learn it. We see that there is adapting without a need for reward. This is shown, but there is adapting already on the first trial before there was any error. There's disentanglement of interacting latent variables. This is a signature of a joint belief update that we believe animals also have it. Network implements belief state dynamics. We saw the mapping from theory to networks, and we can account for behavior, the complex behavior of the mice. Now, do I have 10 more minutes? Okay, just 10 more minutes, so I'll go swiftly through another project. And here we're looking at the corticocerebellar mechanism of motor adaptation. So this work was done by a graduate student who was in my lab, Hugo Nino, is also at ENS. He's done most of the analysis and the theory. We have Lee from my lab who's done the modeling, which you saw at the end. And this is in conjunction with Ifrat Put's lab here, where the experiment and neural recording has been done. And if you ask my technical, there was some of the behavior which will show. And soon you'll see why I have this spider here. Okay, so the question is what is the role of the cerebellum in motor planning and particularly in adaptation? So we're talking about adaptation, neural mechanism of adaptation, and in this work we try to look at the role of the cerebellum in all this in motor adaptation. So the paradigm for experimental is such: we have a monkey who puts his hand in the end, and then he has a cue, telling him which target it should go. Some delay, it gets a go signal, and then you need to reach to the target that we just said. So it's a single target being used by many groups. What's interesting in the data that we have from the Put labs is that they are able to block the cerebellar output using high frequency stimulation. So they send high frequency stimulation to the deep nuclei of the cerebellum, and then they can show that it blocks the output from the deep nuclei to the cortex. And this is reversible. They can do it for some block of time. They block the cerebellum, do the experiments, and then they can release it, do the experiment again. That gives us a way to probe what is the role of the cerebellum in this adaptation. So in general, cerebellar output blocks. So the output block impairs behavior. So if you look at the activity or control of different targets, if you do it under HFS, the behavior is not so well, although as we'll see in a second, the monkey can adapt, can still perform under the HFS. Then we're asking about adaptation. The question here is adaptation. So to ask about adaptation, we need to introduce some perturbation, external perturbation, the change that the monkey needs to adapt to. In this case, it's a force field or a coiled force field. So basically, it pushes a hand either clockwise or counterclockwise as it tries to reach. And we can do all experiment with force field, without force field, and force field for both sides, using with HFS or without HFS. So while blocking the cerebellum and unblocking the cerebellum. And the first thing that we see that when you have cerebellar, when blocking paracerebellar output, there is a poor adaptation to the perturbation. So we measure it by the maximum deviation of the arm as it reaches to the target, and we see that adaptation stops, and we have poor performances. Okay, and now what Ifrat Speed and Sharon in particular did is explain is also record for motor cortex, premotor cortex at that time, and now we're going to look at the activity of the neurons in the motor cortex during that experiment, with and without blockage of the cerebellum. So in general, how the activity looks like, it had this sort here. So the neurons, if we look at the first pieces of the activity, they start somewhere here, and then as you can see the Q and the go, and already in the Q, we see that the activity starts to separate. The go Q is actually here at the edges. So this neural trajectory stops, and the monkey starts moving. So we are looking specifically at the preparation of movement. And here you see the PC1 over P3, and this is, now you can see where we got this idea of a spider from Maman statue from Louis Bourgeois, I think it's called in French. Right? This is a famous statue that was said in the Tate Museum. So one of the interesting things that we see, I won't run into details, but is the fact that we see that the blocking the cerebellum or the cerebellum modify the cortical activity in a task-aware manner, in a way that it understands the shape or the topology of the task. So here we see what happens when we're doing cerebellar block on our activity. When we look at those PC, we see pretty much that what happened in the second principal component, there's a huge separation. So you can look at it as just there's no cerebellar input, some constant cerebellum input, but for all traces, it's not specifically aware. But if you look at some other principal controlling, and specifically principal control 5, you see that the changes in the activity depends on the color, meaning depends on the target, meaning that the cerebellar input during motor preparation depends on the target themselves. So we already see some involvement here of the cerebellum in motor preparation. So what is happening in cortex during cerebellar block? So here we're looking at the angle. Once we have this the spider, we're looking at the legs of the spider around go. So we have the circle, and the circle tells us right. The circle here tells us the directions of the target. And it's actually it really matches the order of the targets in on the screen. Now, what we can do for single trial is just calculate where the monkey is aiming in neural space. Each one, and ask what the monkey is doing when the cerebellum is blocked. So first we see that without cerebellum, even if we turn the force field either clockwise or counterclockwise, we see that the monkey is still, on average, aiming to the middle. It's more noisy, but the monkey is still averaging to the middle, even with the force field. But when we cut the cerebellum, the monkey needs to change its plan. And we can see that without cerebellar input, the overall activity of the neural shifts either clockwise or counterclockwise. You can think about it as a monkey trying to re-aim his decision in the cortex, right? So think about the force field as some wind operating in the right or left, and when the monkey understands that, he needs to re-aim, and the re-aiming happens already in the motor cortex. But that's not all what happens or it affects, so it's cortical motor preparation, but that's not all what happens in the cortical activity. We measure the dimensionality of the activity. So we measure here dimensionality by the participating dimension. It's a common way to measure dimensionality, and we did it for different points in time using control and HFS. So this is the dimensionality over all targets in the space. And we see that in general, after Q, dimensionality drops, but with lack of cerebellar input, the dimensionality does not drop. It's a higher, it drops, but less. There's a higher dimensionality for the cortical activity when there is no cerebellar input. So what does it mean? Basically, it means that increased dimensionality means there's also some changes in the topology of the target that we somehow will need to account. How can we account this change in topology? We're using measure that was developed by Bernardi et al. From Stefano Fusi lab, which is a cross-condition generalization performance. I'll explain here in shortly what it means. Imagine that we want to see how well can we generalize or can we read out a specific target cohere. So I can say we can using a linear readout, so we can decide on random labeling of the targets, either left or right here, and then train linear readout. But what we do, we train only on half of the data, and we test on the rest of the data. Now, if there is some, they call it abstraction, but if there's some structure in the data, and they all line on a plane, sorry, then learning these results will help us improve even on the test. And we can do it again and again and again for different type of dichotomies. We can choose labeling this way and train this way, and there are different ways to do it, and we can then take the average of all dichotomies as we have. Now, how it's related to topology, because imagine that our data comes from a circle, as we said, but when the dimensionality of the cortical representation increase, we are deforming the circle in higher dimensions. It's hard to paint it, but imagine that those dots are starting to move in higher dimension, and we no longer have this abstraction, this ability to do this cross condition or to train some of the data and operate on the rest. So what would you expect? Would you expect that cross generalization will remove it? And here we see it for different trials. We see that in general, this is from the neural data. When you perform cross generalization on the neural data, without force, just HFS or not HFS, the activity of the target, we are unable to do this cross generalization, meaning we cannot carry from one point to another. And after we realized that, we looked for some evidence in behavior. So this is when we turned to Vreeswijk from the Technion. So he did a very similar experiment to our case, but then he measured how well does the neuron generalize. So he's training them on a force field, they're training the neurons using a force field to some target, and then they're measuring how well does the monkey perform given that force field on a nearby target with HFS or without HFS or without cerebellum. And we can see that the generalization performance without the cerebellum are much worse. So we see here the absolute error of the abilities. This is again behavior of the monkeys, and we can see the behavior is much worse on the target when HFS is on. It's basically losing this topology. The kind of the monkey loses its direction or its orientation or on the circle of the results and is unable to change from one point to another. This relates to an older work on humans when they measured humans with cerebellar patients on similar tasks with forces. Actually, in this work, they tried to measure something else about the direction or the size of the error. One of the findings is that also human cerebellar patients do not generalize as well as control to force field in different directions. So I need to finish here, so I'll just run quick. We also did a model for that, just to understand what happened. We have a very simplified model. We have cortical circuit, which is a recurrent neural network. We have an input here, which is high dimensional, that tells us which target you can, and we have a cerebellar circuit. For the cerebellar circuit, we just use a feedback circuit, so the cerebellum gets the input from the cortex, and it returns a low dimensional feedback. How we do that? First, we have the dynamics of the network itself. So this is a randomly connected network dynamics when G is strong enough. So this is a chaotic and a noisy chaotic network. We have some input unstructured. So all those matrices are random Gaussians, and U here is just a one-hot vector of size 8. It tells us which of the target has been activated. Now Z would be the feedback from the cerebellum, and it's just being read off from the activity of the neurons, but we're training this read off, and we use it using force algorithm. But the idea is just we're giving some single input here. We're reading out the correct topology, over the circuit, and we're feeding it back. And you can see already here, it's hard to get the same numbers that there is in real data, but you see that just by reducing this cortex, so we don't know in the cortex if it's a complete block of cerebellum, or there could be some learning in the cortex that reduces dimensionality. But when we reduce this dimensional feedback or dimensional aware inputs to the network by reducing beta, we see that the dimensionality increases as we reduce beta, and the cross correlation difference reduces to match with what we've seen in the data. So to summarize this part, without cerebellar input, the cortical representation adapts to a force field. The cerebellar output is low dimensional and task aware, and the cerebellar output decreases the dimensionality of motor activity. Now, an open question, I think, which is still interesting, is are those two related? Because when you think about it, those two phenomena be completely unrelated. It could be that the cortex changes its representation because now the cerebellum does not control the movement during an activity, and so the cortex needs to compensate by re-aiming because it no longer have an online controller of the activity that can fix the activity. And the dimensionality is because there is some low dimensional input due to the cortex. But theoretically, they could be related. And this is what we're working on now. And the idea is that if you have just a simple readout, imagine that the readout from the cortex is not, the activity is not going through the cerebellum, just reading out the motor commands going directly from the cortex. And we know that when we turn on HFS and the force field, the monkey needs to relearn everything. So what happens if we are now in a higher dimensional activity and the monkey needs to relearn that, it's really hard to change the readout to match the targets, and because we don't have this simple structure. And it could be that this is one of the reasons that the cortical representation itself needs to shift, because the cerebellum can no longer simply or the outputs of the cerebellum, an external output can no longer read out this abstract and target aware activity. So the cortex needs to compensate. This is still an open question. Okay, so this is pretty much what I wanted to present. So this is the group and the people who worked on it for my group: John, Jan, Hugo, and Lee. I thank you to the time, and I'm happy to hear. I don't know how the question works here, but I guess Ran will let us know. Thank you.